Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're really delighted to welcome you all to St Anne's College tonight. I'm Helen King, and it's my absolute privilege to be Principal of St Anne's. We're a college that has always had a purpose, initially to enable women to access an Oxford education in the most affordable and flexible way possible. And ever since, we've made sure that we're true to our purpose, true to our legacy, but also looking to the future. When I arrived a few years ago, we did quite a lot of work as a community to make sure we really were clear about our purpose. And one of the things we wanted to make sure we were doing was taking pride in supporting, enabling, and promoting our academics research. And that's really what tonight is about. I think it's also very fitting, the subject of the book that we're here to learn about, challenge, debate this evening, because another part of the St Anne's purpose is to support and guide all in our community to be well and do well. And of course, that sounds a bit like flourishing to me. Maybe that's the word we should have used. So, as I say, it's a delight to welcome the audience tonight and a real privilege for us all to welcome our panel. And it's fallen to me to do a very brief introduction to you all. Of course, let's introduce our authors, co-authors first. I think Professor Andrew Briggs doesn't need much introduction to members of St Anne's. He's been a member of and a fellow of the college for many years, and we're very proud of his achievements. He's Professor of Nanomaterials at the Department of Materials here at the university, and his current work is on quantum technologies. But he, like many other members of the panel, is a real polymath. I don't think there are many who start their academic career with an undergraduate degree and then a doctorate in physics before going on to take a degree in theology at Cambridge, during which he won the Chase Prize for Greek. And his co-author also is a very talented and multidisciplinary academic. Michael Reiss is the Professor of Science Education at University College London. He's a bioethicist, educator, journalist, and also an Anglican priest. Tonight's conversation, and I know Michael and Andrew are hoping it's going to become a heated debate, is going to be chaired by another long-standing and highly valued fellow of St Anne's College, Roger Crisp, the Uhiro Fellow and Tutor in Philosophy, Professor of Moral Philosophy, whose work principally falls within the field of ethics. Roger, we're delighted that you're going to adjudicate, perhaps referee, the conversation this evening. And to spark off the conversation, which we hope will very much involve all of you as members of the audience as well, our two panel members. We're delighted to welcome Bill Wood, Associate Professor of Philosophical Theology here at Oxford and a Fellow of Oriel College, and also Uta Balbier, who has recently joined St Anne's as a Fellow in History from King's College London. Uta's a historian of the 20th century United States with a particular interest in religion, and she seeks through her research to enhance our understanding of the myriad ways in which religion underpins concepts of national belonging. So it's going to be a fascinating, multidisciplinary, and I'm sure wide-ranging conversation this evening. And I'm delighted to now hand over to Roger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Welcome to everybody and good evening. It's a great honour and pleasure to be asked to chair this panel to launch this important book by Andrew and Michael. Let me say something about these microphones. They do not amplify our voices. They're to make a recording. So when one of you asks a question, I might have to restate it so that it goes into the microphone, depending on how loudly you ask your question. We also require your consent for this recording to be played back. I don't think we need your consent now to be recorded, but if you ask a question and afterwards think, I wish I hadn't asked that question, then let us know and we will delete it from the recording. But obviously I hope that won't happen. So just to give you an idea of the run of play, the authors will talk for maybe 7 or 8 minutes each about the book to remind you of what is in it. And then each of our panelists will offer us some reflections on the book for maybe 2 or 3 minutes each. We might then have a bit of discussion among ourselves, depending on what is said, and then we'll throw the floor open for discussion. So I'm going to hand over to either Andrew or Michael, whoever would like to go first.
Thank you very much, Roger. And thank you all for coming. And thanks to Andrew Pinson for that wonderful introduction. Here in St. Anne's College, almost exactly 4 years ago, in November 2017, a group of us were brainstorming about where the Templeton World Charity Foundation could make the greatest impact. Human flourishing floated to the top, and that has led to a current $60 million funding program of research led by the current president. It also led to this book. People sometimes ask how Michael and I could complete a book together and still stay friends. Well, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien had very different ways of working. C.S. Lewis would finish a book, send it off to the publisher, and start on the next one. Tolkien, on the other hand, was never satisfied and was forever wanting to make further revisions. And I am very grateful, Michael, to you for being my Tolkien. For being my Lewis. To my Tolkien, otherwise I might still be revising the book to this day. We identified 3 dimensions of flourishing. The first is material, because it's hard to flourish if you're living in extreme poverty. Paul Collier's bottom billion have all but vanished in East Asia and the Pacific since this graph started in 1990, and they're predicted to diminish in South Asia by 2030. But the prospects for sub-Saharan Africa are not so bright. The second dimension is relational, because it's not good for humans to be lonely. And that's why marriage is a good predictor of happiness, although this graph shows only statistics, and we all know unmarried people who are very happy and contribute greatly to human flourishing. We called our third dimension transcendent, because even when the material and relational dimensions are in place, there seems to be a longing for something beyond those, without which human flourishing is somehow spiritually impoverished. And the book is all about how these dimensions of human flourishing can be promoted by the best of both scientific insight and spiritual wisdom. Our first working title was Improbable Bedfellows, but some people thought that that might refer to Michael and me, and so we dropped that title. Human flourishing is not suspended in midair with no visible means of support. And as 3 pillars of human flourishing, we identified truth, purpose, and meaning. And I love these analyses of trustworthiness by profession, with scientists coming top. And I don't know if Helen's still here, but yes, you are. Police don't do too badly either, Helen. They come quite well as well. You can one of the surprising things that we found across truth and purpose and meaning is the extent of human choice. So you can ask, has the universe got a purpose? Is there a purpose to life, as though it was something objective to be found? And we understand what's meant by that question. But when it comes to the individual, our purposes as individuals is a sort of complex entanglement between the objective reality of our talents and circumstances and choices that we make, and to some extent, things that are, ways that we can create purpose. Individual response can be even more apparent in meaning. This is a picture by Roger Wagner, who's here in the audience, called Writing in the Dust. I once had a copy in my office until someone mistook it for promoting stoning of Muslim women. And the story on which this is based is sometimes known as the woman caught in adultery. Roger wrote a poem about this picture, which he entitled The Men Caught in Hypocrisy. In part 3 of the book, we apply those principles that we've developed to different case studies where we see changes happening which require either new approaches to human flourishing or at least the conventional approaches to be applied afresh. The first is in the social sciences, where the old model of Homo economicus as rational, selfish, greedy, lazy man is being replaced by people like Colin Mayer, who's in the audience this evening, by what we call Homo fidelis, intuitive, generous, altruistic, energetic women and men. And the old certainties of modeling are being replaced by a recognition that often there's radical uncertainty. And human flourishing needs to be robust against the vicissitudes of the limits to predictability. The second changing pattern that we identified is changing patterns of religious commitment in a world that seems to be simultaneously utterly secular and deeply religious. This data here is from the Pew Research Center surveys over 10 years, and you can see the brown and orange areas are countries in which the overwhelming majority of people say that religion is very important to them. Sometimes talk of a post-Christian Europe needs to be replaced by talk of a post-European Christianity, with rapid growth occurring in certainly Africa and probably in China too, though it's harder to get the statistics. And this matters for human flourishing because well, of many reasons, but one that's dear to my heart is the relationship to attitudes to science. So the left-hand graph, this is taken from the Wellcome Global Monitor, for which Gallup surveyed 140 countries, 1,000 people in each country, so 140,000 people. And the left-hand graph map, we've plotted countries where up to 72% of the whole population say that science disagrees with their religion. And in the right-hand graph, we've plotted the percentage of population showing countries where up to 96% say that if they had to choose where they perceive a conflict, they would choose their religion over science. And you can quickly see the impact that that will have on human flourishing. As a teenager, I came across an amazing description of love, which has inspired me and stayed with me ever since. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It's not arrogant or rude. It doesn't insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And in promoting human flourishing, this book seeks to resource love like that with the best of scientific insight and the best of spiritual wisdom. At this point, let me hand over to Michael.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. And let me say to Helen King, great honour to be able to be here in St Anne's this evening. And thank you, Roger, for chairing, and Uta and Bill as well, and Andrew for all the photography and so on. And thank you for those of you who've been able to come. That's really appreciated, because many of us haven't been coming the last year and a half for obvious reasons to as many events. I think Andrew's being a little bit generous talking about me being a Lewis to his Tolkien. In fact, continuing with the COVID theme, I got so behind with writing my chunks of the book that if it hadn't been for stopping doing all international travel to conferences and so on, I would have been desperately late. But we do have different ways of working and writing, and I've always believed that one of the benefits of working with somebody who has both different knowledge and different ways of working is that the end product is much better than what one could have done on one's own, and that's absolutely the case. So thank you, Andrew. Andrew completely fleshed out the sort of 9 main chapters of the book before I even became involved. And with very minor finessing, that's the way we have stuck to it. We met 3.5 years ago at a drinks party, having known each other for many, many years before that. And as one does, I said to Andrew, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I've just got a big project coming up on human flourishing." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. The last short book I wrote was about flourishing in education." And 10 minutes later, whether it was the very good champagne provided by the clothworkers, I don't know, we seemed to have more or less agreed we were going to work on the project together. One output of which was a long report on a very specific aspect, artificial intelligence and digital technologies, with Dominic Burbidge, but the other output of it is this. And I just want to show a few slides to emphasize 1 or 2 things. I'm glad to say I got to the Ashmolean this afternoon, where I saw the original of this wonderful illustration by Monica Reisner, which is on the front of our book, which is taken as an illustration of Dante, with it being the 700th anniversary at the moment. And as Andrew said, we have 3 fundamental dimensions: material, relational, and transcendent. And the material relationship is obvious if you haven't got enough of certain things like income, food, medical treatment, etc., you are going to be disadvantaged. But of course, many of us live in a society where we can have too much. So this is a photograph from a compulsive hoarder. I wasn't quite brave enough to suggest to Jenny, though I've since mentioned it to her, that we could have taken a photograph of our garage, which would have been entirely suitable for this book. This is a commercially available one. And one of the nice things about doing books like this is the amount of reading one does and how much one learns. So this graph, for example, shows from 1970 to roughly the present day, for United States undergraduates, what they say they most want to get out of their college education, if they've gone to higher education. So you can see genuinely this remarkable change between people born in the late 40s and 50s of the left hand, were basically developing a meaningful philosophy of life of the various options given, was the one they most agreed with, to now, the last 30 years or so, and it's still going upwards, being very well off financially. So material considerations, as we all know, are important and have a powerful influence. This shows a photograph of somebody called Jean-Dominique Bauby, who's best known as the author of a book which some of you will have read, called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. So he suffered from a rare syndrome where somebody quite suddenly moves from being as able in terms of movement as any of us is, to only being able to communicate by moving their eyelids. One of the more remarkable things we found in our reading was that while, not very surprisingly, immediately after this medical emergency, these people when you give them standard validated psychological tests, are not very happy, within 6 months, people in this condition report self-reported flourishing, happiness, satisfaction measures that are virtually indistinguishable from the general population. Humans have an extraordinary ability to adapt to new circumstances. If you're struck down with severe depression, that's not the case. You have much lower levels that remains as long as you're depressed. But for the vast majority of physical ailments, after a while, your happiness levels return to what they were. One or two other slides just to show you. This is a fascinating one, I always think. The typical measures, like how the problems that people have in countries, like health problems, social problems, are surprisingly tightly correlated with how unequal that country is. So the right-hand side, you have countries like the USA. On the left, you always end up with Japan and the Scandinavian countries that have much lower variance in either income or wealth. And the correlation here from memory is 0.56, which is a social scientist. Sorry, that's the square of the correlation. So 56% of the variation in the vertical axis, an index of health and social problems, is explained by how unequal the society is. As Andrew said, we get onto relational issues, we get onto transcendent issues, we get into things like, why do so many people enjoy, whether it's singing in large numbers, concerts in large numbers, worship in large numbers? And I'm not going to have a quiz, but I think some of you would find it quite difficult to distinguish as to whether this is a rock concert or an evangelical meeting. We do get onto the transcendent, as Andrew said, and we spend quite a lot of time, because for both of us, conventional religion is important. But for many people, as Andrew showed, it's not. And we didn't want to have a treatment of the transcendent that only spoke to people with conventional religious faith. So we spent quite a bit of time getting into how other people find a meaning which seems to, as it were, go beyond the everyday, whether through nature, everyday nature, astronomical phenomena, or whatever. And the book isn't hugely about science and religion and the relationship between them, because Andrew in particular and many other people have written that before that. But both of those come into every chapter, hence the title of the book and the subtitle. And this is a cartoon we both quite like, which shows a couple of scientists or mathematicians, and in the middle of the complicated reasoning, there's a phrase, then a miracle occurs, and one scientist or mathematician is saying to the other, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. And of course, that's all about the way that people work, the methodologies they use within a discipline, which may or may not relate to their own personal beliefs. Let me just show you a couple of final slides. This is a remarkable slide, which neither of us knew before we got this book. And the short version of it is, countries where people believe in heaven, but don't believe in hell, the average person is much happier than if you also believe in hell. Now, at one level, that's not very surprising, but I really didn't think nowadays those sort of beliefs would have measurable average effects. And again, it's a very tight correlation, remarkably. The last bit of the book, as Andrew said, is a bit about new technologies. This is frankly a bit of an over-optimistic promotional for robots, but we are quite interested in what new technologies will mean for human flourishing, whether it's in social care. Not just robots, we're interested in new technologies. So this shows a photograph of Beth and Christian Gardino taken in 2017, where Christian Gardino was one of the first people with a form of hereditary blindness that was successfully treated with gene editing. And the two technologies we particularly concentrate on are gene editing and machine learning. Thank you. That's it from Andrew and me.
Well, thanks very much, Andrew and Michael. So we'll now turn to our commentators, and I'll begin by asking Usa to share her responses to the book.
It's an absolute privilege and joy to be here. And let me start by saying how much I enjoyed reading the book. It's a tour de force through hundreds of years of Western philosophy, theology, political thought, popular culture, interwoven with personal anecdotes, and the organizers have given me 2 minutes to respond to it. As an Americanist, something really, really interesting happened in my mind while I was reading the book, and I kept coming back to the Declaration of Independence, and I kept coming back to this term, the pursuit of happiness. So we've been grappling with what was meant by that. It's life, liberty, but there's this human right to the pursuit of happiness. And it was this book that made this notion tangible for me. And the authors already talked us through it and said, well, there is the material dimension, but there's much more than that. And what I admire the most in the narrative is the way you bring religion into the conversation. Because religion, in the way our eyes are opened here to different kinds of flourishing, is not the dominating voice. It is one democratic voice among many. And I think we can't say that often enough, because that's the basis for how in our secular society we can have a meaningful conversation between people of faith and those who are not of faith. And I think that is a very important conversation. This book provides a wonderful foundation for it to have. So I think that is, for me, one of the key strengths of this book. The second line from the Declaration of Independence that kept ringing in my head while I read it was, all men are created equal. And you tackled so much philosophically, theoretically. You've seen the data sets. The book spans continents, countries, societies. And still, it raises for me the important question, is human flourishing a universal category? And I'm sure you would all disagree. Another strength of the book is when you bring in the narratives of those living with disabilities. They are the living example for us to challenge our Western capitalist of the neoliberal understandings of happiness. They tell completely different stories. And still, I would like to push the authors even further to think about other groups which didn't have such a powerful voice in the narrative you're building your work on, the Western philosophy, the Western theology. I'm thinking about, do humans who self-identify as female, as queer, are of color, the list is getting longer, how do their stories help us to an even more complex understanding of what it means as humans to flourish? And that is the point where I would really like to hear more about, to make this really important narrative even more robust and powerful. I can't thank you enough.
Thank you very much. Now we turn to Bill.
Thank you. Even though this isn't a book about science and religion, I want to begin by expressing my appreciation for the approach that the authors take towards science and religion, because even among my students here in Oxford who ought to know better, there's still a strong presumption that science and religion are mutually antagonistic. And we can take the next step and say that they're not, that they're compatible, but few, either in theology or in science, take the third step and say they're not only compatible in some logical sense, but mutually reinforcing. And so I really appreciate that very much as someone who kind of works in this area. And beyond that, I'd like to express more specific appreciation to kind of picking up on some of the themes that Ute already raised. The approach to human flourishing, I think, strikes exactly the right balance between holistic and capacious on the one hand, but not sort of overly in favor of religious adherence on the other. And I say that as an academic theologian who is a big fan of religious adherence. But we get this story that is I think the right story about the material human being as the foundation for human flourishing, and then the second layer of relationality, and then the third layer of transcendence is incredibly important, but it would be really easy to turn that into something like an argument for religious adherence, or if not an argument, a sort of strong steer towards religious adherence. And I think it's absolutely right that we shouldn't make that move in a book like this. There is a place for that kind of move, I think, but it's not this book. And I appreciate that the authors didn't take that step. And then the other theme that I'd like to pick up on, which is another issue sort of close to my own heart, professionally and personally, is their approach to truth. And so we all know that truth is a sort of cheap commodity these days. We can find it wherever we want to, and we can make up our own, and we all get our own truth, it seems. And I think any sort of work that tries to join science and religion really does need to take some kind of approach towards the fundamental issue of truth. And as both a humanist and as a theologian, I appreciate that the approach that they have taken is, again, capacious. All truth is interpretive, even in the hard sciences. That's a really important lesson to learn. But that isn't the same thing as relativism, and we all get to pick our own truth. I think that's probably the single lesson that is most needed in the academy and in the wider society at the moment. And so I really appreciate that was in there. And so, with that, I will express again my gratitude to the authors and my gratitude to St. Anne's for hosting this event. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Bill and Uta. Now, would either Michael or Andrew like to say anything in response to those comments?
Well, I'm happy to warm to something that you said, Uta, about recognizing the dignity and value and capacity for flourishing of people, who aren't just smart, clever, successful Oxford academics, all these other things. In a couple of ways. One of them is to say that sometimes we make the mistake of being too individualistic about flourishing. And we just say, is that person flourishing? Well, that person is part of a community. They may be part of a family or a society or whatever. And so there's a place for moving beyond the individual to the community. And I think you quite often see that with severely disabled people, that they promote flourishing in the circle that they're in. And the other one is a little bit of an anecdote that actually when we, in the first draft of the book, we started with stories about Jean Vanier, who is this amazing Catholic who, well, he could have had a successful career in lots of ways, but he actually started the L'Arche movement of having sort of roughly equal numbers of severely disabled people and normally abled people living together. The reason we took that out was because of the disclosure of some very sad misdemeanors, which we felt made it no longer appropriate to make that the thing of the book. But if one can leave those on one side and just take what he did to promote the dignity of these disabled people, we very much warm to that.
So I think at this point we can open the floor to comments or questions.
I'd really just like to reiterate what the discussant said about the wonderful nature of this book by retaining the combination of humanities, social sciences, and sciences throughout. But I just want to ask a very straightforward question based on what we've just said, and that is, if it causes us such unhappiness, why did we ever invent hell?
Well, I'm happy to defer in a second or two to an academic theologian on this
Luckily,
question.
I didn't write the book, so I don't have to answer that question.
I think for me, almost anything in the human mind, whether it's a category like hell or anything else, is very interesting because I see it as a sort of intersection between a perception of a reality and an attempt within the human mind to make some sense of it. And things get overstated. I mean, I remember reading as a teenager Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which some of you may know, which is a wonderful example of an argument against conventional religion because of the most terrifying sermon within it. But presumably, to some extent, notions of hell are trying to grapple with the question of why is there evil in the world and what eventually is going to happen to terrible things. Are they going to win, or are they going to be in some sense either redeemed or conquered?
Any other comments on that, Bill?
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't want to take a position right now on whether Christians should believe in hell or not. But I think the sort of the drive towards thinking that there is a place where the truly wicked are punished is an easy thing to understand. I think the more challenging thing to understand is how is that we should resist our attraction to that drive. I think even on good Christian grounds, we should think that punishment is never the final word, that the final word is love and redemption and restoration. So I'm inclined to think, this specific answer to your question, why did we invent the concept of hell, is it's a really natural thing to want. And the sort of wider answer is, even though it's a really natural thing to want, it's probably better not to want it too much and to try to resist it in the name of a deeper kind of love.
Could I very quickly come in on this as a historian of religion? And I would like to ask the authors, what makes organized religion? And you grapple with it in the book, and because there's this shift to people believe more than they belong. But what do you think could this put a whole, slow down the secularization process? Do people want to hear about hell because it gives them clarity? Or do they not want to hear about hell because they enjoy significantly more a form of religion which promises prosperity and happiness? And
well, I do appreciate these straightforward questions we're getting both from the audience and from the panelists. Andrew, do you want to answer that one?
The great thing is to address the question I wish you'd asked, which is, do we care about what happens after we die? And it is amazing how much more time people often spend planning their next holiday than they do thinking about what might happen after they die. And we quote a little, I love these thought experiments. One of the ones that we quote in the book is the thought experiment as follows. You're told that you're going to live a normal life and you're going to die just as you would have done, with all the uncertainties of life. 1 month after you die, the whole of humanity will be wiped out. And within this thought experiment, you're not allowed to ask how you know that, and you're not allowed to ask whether you could avoid it or anything like that, okay? That's going to happen. The question, what difference would that make to how you live now? And I think that few people would be unmoved by that. I think that few people would be unaffected by it. And this was a thought experiment that was devised by someone who, as far as I know, doesn't believe in God and doesn't believe in any sort of conventional Christian or Jewish concept of the resurrection, to help people to focus on the extent to which they do care about what might happen after they die. And for me, that helps to focus back on the topic of the book. You know, what is human flourishing? And what is it that we're trying to promote if we say we want to promote human flourishing?
Thanks very much. It's great to see the project come to fruition. So my question is whether you move from the empirical to the normative. So there are a lot of things that correlate with human flourishing, and then the question is, what do you want people to do about that? So should it be that we act to encourage the sorts of things that correlate with human flourishing? Should that be government's role? Or could it be that if you do it for reasons of being happy, some of the activities or ways of being you've outlined may not be as correlating in future with happiness if done, for example, for my own well-being versus other reasons?
So, Michael, the empirical and the normative.
Yeah. So I think I'd say we don't have within the book an overt strand of what should be done. It's written in a sense at a slightly lighter level, so an awful lot is left up to the reader. Myself, in co-authoring it, I found myself shifting a number of my views. So this is well-known research. I mentioned the stuff about the importance of inequalities within countries. It's difficult, I think, to argue against the notion that governments would do better for their people if, without going into a sort of, extreme version of hyper-socialism, they used standard measures to reduce extreme inequalities within the country. So that's a normative end that I think does follow from empirical data, despite all the problems of moving from empirical to normative. The relational, I think, just showed the value of good relationships, which is not the most surprising conclusion of all time. And those relationships can be within a family, they can be within a circle of friends, or they can be distributed more widely. And the transcendent is the bit where I'd feel most strongly we don't have a normative view for exactly the sort of reasons that both Bill and Uta talked about, because certainly within a conventional religious notion of the transcendent, we're not trying to push heavily in one direction for what governments should do. I'd be quite content if people thought about, I'd never thought about the relationship, for example, between enjoying nature and the transcendent before, whether or not it has a religious element. And for other people, especially people for whom religion is unimportant and they haven't given it a great deal of thought, I'd be delighted if they found themselves thinking, there's some rather good points here about conventional religion and meaning and the transcendent that I hadn't thought of before, and I perhaps can't dismiss quite as easily as I might have assumed.
Thanks. Andrew?
I think let's move on.
Okay.
So this book seems to address a pretty broad audience and some major questions. One concern I have is that the people who decide to read a book called Human Flourishing are perhaps not the ones that most urgently need this book. Is this something that you have considered, where you can make sure that people who are definitely never going to read this book get their hands on this book?
Could we take you on as our marketing agent?
Some of you will know that Erica John's book, Fear of Flying, which I'm afraid I hadn't read, but I gather is not really about aircraft, sells very well in, what's the word? Where do you take off planes from normally? Airports, that's it. Sells very well in airports. Human Flourishing, we hoped, was a broad enough title that actually quite a lot of people might be interested in it. But I admit, if we'd wanted to have an even more overtly catchy title, we could have gone for one of the more standard popular phraseologies. There's quite a lot of stuff within the book about what's the relationship between flourishing and happiness, and whether these things are self-reported measures, at any one time, whether they're measured over a person's lifetime, there are various ways of doing that, or whether they're objective measures of happiness, indeed. And by the way, thank you for these plugs to the book, because we have our wonderfully able assistant in the front row who just happens to be married to Andrew, who for only £20, which is 5 less than today's price on Amazon, is happy to sell a copy of the book to anyone who would like it on the way out. Thank you. And that will make both your 2 authors slightly happier, because about 7.5% between us goes to a very good cause for each copy sold.
Well, after the ad break.
Actually, it is an opportunity to thank Zonka Adlong, who's here in the audience and who's our tirelessly supportive editor at OUP. Zonka, thank you for supporting it. And I think there's now a message of this. I was told by someone who understands these things that it was a terrible mistake not to have on the cover a picture of a dog. Because if you have a picture of a dog on the cover, it sells one. So maybe for the paperback, we should have a picture of a dog to sell to exactly those people you were suggesting.
30 years ago, I was working in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and I learned a lot from that experience. One was how the middle class is different. So middle class in Sao Paulo, everyone knew everyone else on the same street. So it was very striking to me. But as it got really rich, they began to close themselves off in their own private fortresses, really. So I began to wonder what about development, because I was working in business, working the development of the Brazilian high-tech economy. I wondered how would it really benefit these people in the end if we just happen to be like us, where we don't know one another in the same streets. So I'd like to comment on that, if you don't mind, because the strands you highlight, maybe you haven't prioritised which one you think is most important, or how they should be hierarchically ordered. And I'd like to consider another question, was what to teach collectively our children. So are there any little heuristics that will be of help to those bringing up children today in one way or another?
Andrew?
Can you summarise the question?
Shall I get a bit of it? Can I start with one or two responses?
Yeah.
Because we shouldn't forget the material. You know, I'm well off, my parents are well off, so I've never been short of food, clean water, medical assistance. In every country in the world, there's a financial point at which if your income is less than that, each $1,000 less, you are measurably less happy. So in a country like the UK or the US, it's about, per person, about $40,000, so 25-ish, upper 20s thousand pounds, which is quite a lot because that's about the average income in this country, which fairly obviously means there are a lot of people not on that. So the material is really important. But then, as you point out from your São Paulo experience, as most of us knows, there comes a point where it doesn't hugely matter how much money you have. It doesn't really relate to happiness. It doesn't go down, by the way, statistically, you know, so that's really good news for the billionaires amongst us. It doesn't go down, but it's no better than the $40,000 a person. And the relational, it's not about the number of friends, whether on Facebook or in reality, it's about the quality of the relationship with a small number, whether family in a related sense or non-family. And in terms of children, my own view as an educator, the crucial thing is simply to get people to think of more ways, because schools are not good at getting people overtly to think of what do I want to do with my life. And you should never be preachy about that, but explicit consideration before people make quite important choices about careers might be helpful for many people.
Anything to add, Andrew?
There was one year when I had a private ski instructor with my younger daughter. And the ski instructor worked out that both of us could ski reasonably well. And so instead of taking us down a mountain and saying, you ski this bit this way, and you ski this bit that way, and you ski the next bit this way, she got us to ski the same slope repeatedly, but each time skiing it in an utterly different way. So one time we had to make ourselves like tiny mice. And then on another occasion we had to ski it like tin soldiers, absolutely rigid, you know, how you would never normally teach skiing. And weight forward, back, legs apart together, you know, all the variations you could think of. And the point was to expose us to the range of options, so that as we encountered different circumstances, we had a good sense of the range of possibilities that were available to you. So my guess is that when we're wanting to promote flourishing amongst our children, something that helps them to experience and appreciate the range of possibilities from which they could choose may be a contribution that could be made.
Thanks.
Maslow famously had a hierarchy of needs, and you've talked about different dimensions. Is there a hierarchy that you saw? Does one sort of rise to the top as the most important versus others, or does having any one of these in good stead put you in, you know, better place?
I'm keen that the panelists should participate in this.
Could you go first, Ben?
Well, I don't know if I am speaking for the authors or for me, but I think the hierarchy of material, relational, transcendent seems to map on to the trajectory of Maslow's hierarchy of needs in a helpful way. I think I wouldn't want to say all that matters is the material or all that matters is the relational. And I probably wouldn't want to say all that matters is the transcendent. And I think too many religious people probably do that. They think, you know, if you're right with God, it doesn't matter if you're hungry, but that's false. And so I appreciate that the authors took the position that they did.
Well, yes, that summed it up nicely, I have to say. There's just this one example in the book, if you wanted to comment on it, and that is the graph which maps the correlation between religious commitment and the longevity of life and health. Could you comment on that? Would that be helpful and helpful example?
Yeah, there's quite a lot in there. So on the particular point that was just mentioned, on average, and one always has to emphasize this just as Andrew was doing about the marriage and non-marriage, on average, people who self-declare religious either belief or practice or experience have greater longevity when other things are taken into account, like gender, economic circumstance, and higher measures of physical and mental well-being. It's not huge, but it's actually bigger than most people realize. It's the best data are done, say, within nurses, so you can strip out a lot of confounding variables. My own view is this is just a fact. It doesn't sort of tell you what, in a sense, ought to be done. It's just one of these facts. The reason for it seems more to be to do with the quality of relationships, that for some people who don't have a religious faith, it's quite easy to live lives, especially if you're not in a long-term sexual relationship with one person. It's quite easy to live lives where the quality of your relationships, once your parents have died, is poor. Many people for whom religion is important worship in a community. In some cultures, they meet in prayer groups or whatever, go regularly to the mosque or the synagogue or the church. And that relational aspect is crucial. And we have quite a bit in the book about the way in which solitary confinement is used as torture, for example, not with graphic details, but just because the many of us who've never been in solitary confinement for 15 days find it difficult to realize the physical and mental effects it has on most people.
May I chip in just before one question, which is that, Roger, you've thought deeply about these things. You've been a wonderfully impartial chairman, but I'd love your input because I'm sure you've got some insights to share with us.
I did have a follow-up question about the relationship between dimensions and pillars. Would I be right in thinking that the pillars of human flourishing, which are truth, purpose, and meaning, correlate mainly with the relational dimension and the transcendent dimension and not so much the material. Have I got that right?
It's one of these reasons why I didn't study philosophy as an academic subject. Andrew.
I'm a nerd. I'm a material scientist. I'm happiest in many ways when I'm dealing with things, which is the material dimension. And truth is pretty important if you're studying the material dimension. And even science, you know, people think of science as a sort of impartial, objective thing. But you're forever making choices. You're forever trying to interpret and think about meanings. So I wouldn't want to put them in such strong silos myself, I don't think.
But I need to think more carefully. It's a great question. I would need to think more carefully to give you a proper answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Your comment about living longer, if you're a believer, has caused me to ask this question. And the story behind the question is that I talked to A.C. Grayling, as I am now as a as a member of the audience, when he was in a panel, at a book festival at the Sheldonian. And my question for A.C. Grayling was simply, if it is correct that believers will on average 5 years longer than non-believers, and if the humanist movement is successful and converts 10 million people worldwide to not believing, do they feel they have the loss of 50 million man-years of life on their hands? And if so, how does he feel about it? Tom Sheldonian laughed, fortunately, as you have, and Mr. Graham, who I do respect, said, I've never thought of that.
Oh.
So he turned to the man he was debating, who's a friend of his, Roger Scruton, who was very religious. He said, Roger, could you help me out here, please? And Roger's answer was, I thought it was 7 years. I do have a question. I wasn't just here to tell a funny story. My question is, I think this is quite important to the whole issue of science, religion, flourishing. If you really knew there wasn't a God, which I guess would be pretty close to impossible, would you not have a deep responsibility before you started telling people they shouldn't believe, to know that that is the best course of action?
I mean, can I respond that briefly? My own view is, for some strange reason, none of us in the next few minutes is likely with certainty to reach knowledge about whether there is or is not a God. So the really important and interesting thing is in pluralist societies where, again, as Andrew showed the diagram, an increasing number of countries where there's this proportion of people for whom religion is very important and there's a proportion of people for whom it isn't, is how we're going to live together. And that includes how we're going to have decent schools, how we're going to have political debate. And I think that is a question which looks likely to become more and more important as the next few years go by. And I'm really interested in it because, as you're aware, I've reached a certain position in my own views, which of course may change, but they've been fairly consistent for 30-ish, 40 years now. I'm still really interested in it because I don't want, if possible, to live either on a national level or internationally where there are increasingly strong markers that cause different groups of people, whether, as you were intimating, it can be to do with gender, to do with sexuality, to do with colour, to do with religious belief, to do with economic advantage, that just lead to silos.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. Alex?
To what extent did you consider questions of pleasure, and particularly aesthetic pleasure, in how human flourishing might be filled?
Aesthetic pleasure.
Oh, I love that. Probably Roger's the best person to answer the question. Do you want to have a start, Roger? And then I'll have a go.
I'll have a start. I mean, there's quite a lot in the book on what people call positive psychology, which is this movement that began, I think, in the States about 50 or 60 years ago, which focuses on the measurement of subjective well-being, which is essentially pleasurable or enjoyable experience or contentment. And some of that research is relevant to the importance of aesthetic pleasure. But I think probably the main role it plays in the book is in the discussion of the transcendent dimension, because I think the argument there is that, well, I mean, there are several arguments, but I think one argument is that we have the relational dimension where we think of ourselves as part of one part of a relationship with certain other individuals. But then we have these transcendent experiences where we, as it were, rise above ourselves completely. And aesthetic experience is one of the examples given of that. And also the joy, as it were, is all part of that. Does that seem right?
That seems really nicely put. Did you want to follow on?
I can't think of a better way to conclude the discussion and move to human flourishing over drinks.
I think you're right. So, next question: where are the drinks? They're outside. But let me end by thanking all of you for coming and for your excellent questions and comments. I'd like to thank our two commentators.
Yeah.
Yes.
Offering us so many insights. And also, should we just end by congratulating Andrew and Michael for this wonderful book?
Thank you.